Okay, let's unpack this. Take a moment and look around you. The coffee in your mug, the clothes you're wearing, maybe the device you're using right now. How did it all get here?
Yeah, it's easy to just think about things being made, or grown.
Right. But our entire modern world, the one that connects us across oceans and allows like instant communication, it runs on systems far more intricate than just that.
Exactly. It's powered by services, the movement of goods and people, and, well, the exchange of ideas and products globally.
What's fascinating here, I think, is recognizing how human economic activity has just fundamentally transformed over time.
For most of history, the primary focus was, getting resources out of the ground, farming, mining. Then came manufacturing, the secondary sector where we actually made things.
But today, the real powerhouse, especially in developed economies, is the service sector. That's where the jobs are. That's where the value is increasingly generated. It's a huge shift.
It really is.
Exactly. So this deep dive is based on material that charts this massive economic shift. We're going to explore how the global economy has moved towards services, look at the incredibly complex transport and communication networks that make global connection possible.
And then, dive into the dynamics of international trade, the exchange that kind of ties it all together.
Our mission really is to cut through the complexity, pull out the key insights from these sources, and give you a really clear picture of these interconnected systems.
We want to understand what defines the service sector, how we physically and, digitally connect the planet, and what drives the flow of goods and money worldwide.
And right up front, the big shift the sources highlight is this. Developed economies aren't primarily about farming or manufacturing anymore. Not really.
No, they are now overwhelmingly dominated by services and, importantly, knowledge work. It's a fundamental reorientation of human effort and economic value.
It really sets the stage for everything that follows, doesn't it?
It does.
So let's start right there. What exactly are these services that now dominate developed economies? The sources call them tertiary activities. How should we, think about them?
Well, tertiary activities are essentially services provided in exchange for payment. Think of them as intangible products, healthcare, education, legal advice, recreation, stuff like that.
So they require specialized skills, professional training, and often quite a bit of theoretical knowledge.
That's right. And unlike a factory assembly line, the sources really emphasize that people, skilled manpower, are absolutely central to this sector. It's about the expertise of doctors, teachers, consultants, technicians.
That's the core distinction from manufacturing, then.
Yeah, exactly. It's not primarily about production techniques or machinery. It's about the specialized skills, the experience, and the knowledge of the individual performing the service. That's the key.
Okay. The sources also break this down a bit further, noting tertiary activities include the provision of services that are consumed, like, say, a haircut or a doctor's appointment.
Right, where the values may be harder to measure directly, often tracked by wages or salaries. And then there's the other side, facilitating exchange.
Exchange activities.
Right.
Like trade, transport, and communication.
Precisely. These enable movement and connection. They overcome distance, rather than physically transforming materials like manufacturing does.
So we're talking about a really vast range of roles here. The sources list everyone from, a plumber, electrician, or barber, to a teacher, doctor, or lawyer. It really underscores how deeply embedded services are in our daily lives now.
Absolutely. From the really routine stuff to the highly specialized, these are all part of that tertiary sector.
Okay, let's maybe zoom in on a few specific types of tertiary activities that the sources highlight as particularly significant. Trade, services themselves in a bit more detail, and tourism.
Okay. Trade and commerce are fundamental. At its simplest, it's, buying and selling items for profit. Basic exchange.
And the sources point out that this naturally leads to the creation of trading centers. They range from basic rural markets, often periodic, just serving local settlements, think mandis in India, maybe a farmer's market,
to complex urban centers offering not just goods but specialized services, even markets for labor or housing. Much more complex.
And we also see a distinction between retail and wholesale trading. Retail is direct to the consumer, right? Whether in a physical store or through non-store formats like mail order, vending machines, or obviously online now.
Yeah, and wholesale is the bulk side of the business, acting as intermediary, supplying retailers, often providing credit as well. The sources mention innovations like consumer cooperatives, departmental stores, and chain stores as developments that changed retail over time.
Okay, so moving back to services in more detail, the sources show they exist at different levels. Some cater primarily to industry, others directly to people.
And some, like transport, really serve both.
We have low-order services, things we use frequently and find pretty much everywhere, like a corner grocery store or a laundry. Simple, common stuff.
Right. Then there are high-order services, things you need less often, much more specialized, like needing an accountant or, a heart surgeon. These are typically concentrated in fewer locations, usually bigger cities.
And the nature of the labor varies too, from
Yeah.
quite physical work like a gardener or a barber.
To highly mental work, like a teacher or a lawyer or a musician.
Many essential services are also provided or supervised by governments or large companies, things like highways, utilities, firefighting, education.
Definitely. And professional services, like healthcare, engineering, and law, are usually highly regulated for obvious reasons.
Where these services are located often depends heavily on the market. The sources contrast, like the need for high visibility for a multiplex or restaurant in a busy downtown area.
With a service like a golf course, which needs a huge amount of land, so it gets pushed out to cheaper areas outside the city core. Makes sense.
And I found this specific example in the sources particularly striking when thinking about personal services, those supporting daily life like housekeepers or cooks, often provided by migrants. The Mumbai Devawala service is highlighted.
Oh yeah, the tiffin delivery guys. Incredible system.
Delivering lunch boxes to about 175,000 customers daily through this incredibly efficient human network. It's a service industry built on amazing logistics and, well, personal trust.
It perfectly illustrates how human-powered services can achieve remarkable efficiency and scale, doesn't it?
It really does. Now let's look at tourism, which the sources identify as a single massive tertiary activity.
Massive is definitely the word. It's listed as the world's single largest tertiary activity by employment, 250 million registered jobs, apparently, and contributes something like 40% of total GDP. That's huge.
Wow. That scale means it has huge ripple effects, right? Stimulating growth in related industries like infrastructure development, retail, and local craft industries producing souvenirs.
Yeah, and while weather makes it seasonal in some areas, many regions have attractions that draw visitors year-round.
The sources list popular tourist regions, warm climate areas like the Mediterranean or India's west coast, mountain regions for winter sports, areas with scenic landscapes like lakes and coastlines, national parks, and historic towns rich in monuments and heritage.
And the attractions themselves are varied. It could be the climate, sun for beaches, snow for skiing, the landscape's stunning mountains or unspoiled nature, history and art, drawing people to ancient ruins or castles.
Or culture and economy, experiencing local customs, maybe finding affordability, or even participating in things like the homestay tourism mentioned in places like Goa or Coorg in India.
Which leads to a fascinating intersection the sources mention. Medical tourism, combining international travel with medical treatment.
Yeah, that's a growing area. The sources note India's rise as a leading country in this field, citing U.S. patients traveling there for treatment.
It's a significant economic benefit for developing countries like India, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia, who've developed expertise and infrastructure for it.
And it extends to outsourcing medical services too, doesn't it? Like reading radiology images or MRIs remotely.
Exactly. The sources mention this happening with countries like India, Switzerland, and Australia, suggesting it can potentially provide access to specialized care or even improve quality through remote expertise.
This really points towards the growing importance of knowledge-based tasks in the global economy.
Definitely. Which brings us neatly to the next evolution in services, according to the sources. Quaternary and Quinary activities, sometimes called the knowledge economy. Let's start with quaternary.
Okay, quaternary, what defines this?
Quaternary activities are the truly knowledge-intensive part of the service sector. They really center around the collection, production, and dissemination of information.
So this is where research and development really fit in. It requires highly specialized knowledge and technical skills.
Absolutely. The sources highlight that the growth of the quaternary sector, alongside tertiary, has fundamentally changed the basis for economic growth in developed economies. It's less about making things, much more about information and ideas.
That's a huge shift. The sources state that over half of workers in developed economies are now in this knowledge sector, and the demand for information-based services is growing really rapidly.
Examples provided include roles like mutual fund managers, software developers, statisticians, university professors, healthcare professionals in hospitals, and workers in accounting or brokerage firms. It's a broad category.
People whose primary value comes from working with information and ideas.
Exactly. And crucially, like some tertiary services, these activities can often be outsourced. The sources note that they aren't tied to a specific physical location in the same way manufacturing needs resources or local market.
Which leads us to quinary activities, the peak level.
Right, that's how the sources frame it. These are the roles at the very top, the key decision makers and policy makers, distinct from the general knowledge industry.
What's their focus?
Their focus is on the creation, interpretation, and rearrangement of new and existing ideas, evaluating new technologies. Basically, high-level strategic thinking and innovation. The sources use the term gold-collar professions for these roles.
Gold collar reflects their high skill and often high compensation, I imagine.
Precisely. Think senior business executives, top government officials, leading research scientists, high-level financial or legal consultants.
While their numbers might be small, their influence and importance in advanced economies are significant.
Definitely outweighs their numbers.
And the ability to outsource quaternary and even some quinary tasks is a major trend the sources discuss.
Yeah, outsourcing or offshoring when it's overseas is simply contracting work to an external agency. The main drivers, as the sources explain, are pretty straightforward: efficiency and cost reduction.
The sources list common activities being outsourced: IT work, human resources, customer support, call centers.
And sometimes even really complex areas like manufacturing design or engineering analysis.
Why does this happen? What's the core reason?
Comparative advantage, mostly. Finding countries with a pool of skilled workers, often with good English language skills, available at lower wages and with lower operating costs than in, say, North America or Western Europe. The sources mention India, China, Eastern Europe, the Philippines, Costa Rica as examples.
This creates new jobs and economic opportunities in those destination countries, which the sources note can even help reduce migration from those places.
True. But they also mention the flip side, that this trend can cause dissatisfaction and anxiety among job seekers in the countries where jobs are being outsourced from.
Understandable. The sources introduce newer trends too, like KPO.
Right, KPO or knowledge processing outsourcing. It's distinct from the more routine BPO, business process outsourcing, because it involves highly skilled workers performing information-driven tasks like R&D, legal research, or financial analysis. It's higher value work.
Homeshoring, where work is outsourced but stays within the same country, is also mentioned as an alternative.
Yeah, keeps the jobs domestic, but still uses the outsourcing model.
And connecting all this knowledge work and outsourcing back to global access, the sources briefly mention the digital divide.
Right. It's a crucial point. It highlights that access to and the opportunities that come from information and communication technology aren't evenly spread.
There's a gap globally, and often within countries too, isn't there, between well-connected cities and less connected rural or peripheral regions.
Absolutely. And this really impacts who can participate fully in this global knowledge economy we've been talking about.
So we've mapped the shift to services and knowledge, but none of this works on a global scale without the physical movement of things and people.
Exactly. That brings us to the absolutely essential role of transport. The sources emphasize its fundamental purpose, linking where things are produced with where they are consumed, because, well, those locations are rarely the same.
It's basically an organized service industry meeting society's basic need to move stuff around, and it adds value. The sources point out that transportation increases the value of materials at every stage,
by bringing them closer to where they are needed or processed next.
How we think about distance in transport is also key, isn't it? It's not just about the physical length of the route, the kilometers.
No, often it's more about the time distance, how long it takes to travel, or the cost distance, how much it costs. Those are frequently the deciding factors when choosing how to ship something or travel. The sources mention isochrone lines, maps that join places that take the same amount of time to reach.
Interesting. And transport creates networks. The sources define a network as places, which are the nodes, the origins, destinations, or connecting points like towns.
Joined by routes or links. A well-developed network means lots of links and places that are easily connected, easy to get between.
Okay, what influences transport? What makes demand high or determines the routes?
The sources list key factors. Demand, which is heavily influenced by population size, simply put. More people means more movement needed. And the routes themselves depend on things like the location of resources, industries, cities, existing trade patterns, the physical landscape, the climate, and critically, the funds available to build and maintain infrastructure.
Got it. Let's dive into the different modes of transport discussed: land, water, air, and pipelines. Most, except pipelines, carry both passengers and freight. Right.
Right. But their significance varies a lot depending on what you're moving, the cost, and how readily available the infrastructure is.
Land transport obviously has a long history. Starting with human carriers and pack animals, the sources give examples like mules in mountains, camels in deserts, bullocks in India.
Before the wheel brought carts and wagons.
Yeah.
A huge step.
But the real game changers were the steam engine for railways back in the 18th century.
And the internal combustion engine for roads later on. Huge leaps in speed and capacity. Newer developments include pipelines and also things like cableways or ropeways, which are useful in difficult terrain like steep slopes or mines.
It's interesting that the sources note the oldest farms, like human porters, are generally the most expensive per unit moved.
Yeah, counterintuitive maybe,
Hmm.
but true. While large water freighters are often the cheapest for bulk goods, though those older forms still play an important supplementary role in very large, densely populated countries like India and China.
Okay, looking at roads specifically, they're very effective for short distances, aren't they? And offer that crucial door-to-door service for freight, which railways or ports can't quite match.
Definitely. Their limitations are often weather-related. Unmetalled roads become unusable when wet, and even paved roads can be badly affected by heavy rain or floods, whereas railway embankments tend to be a bit more resilient.
But roads are vital for a nation's internal trade, commerce, and tourism. The sources highlight the contrast in quality and density between developed countries.
Yeah, with universal, good-quality roads, motorways, autobahns, highways designed for high-speed, unobstructed movement.
And developing countries where construction and maintenance are just really expensive ongoing challenges.
The sources mentioned the vast global road network, noting North America's particularly high share, about a third, and high density of both roads and vehicles.
Which, of course, leads directly to traffic congestion, especially in cities, with predictable rush hour peaks.
Always fun. The sources list potential urban transport solutions mentioned in the material. Things like higher parking fees, investing in mass rapid transit MRT systems, improving public bus services, and building expressways and highways to bypass local traffic.
Highways themselves are the major arteries metalled, connecting distant places, designed for rapid, unobstructed flow. The sources give examples like the extensive network in North America, including the Trans-Canadian and Pan-American highways,
Australia's transcontinental Stewart Highway, the dense network in Europe, and major roads in China and India, including India's Golden Quadrilateral connecting its 4 major metros. Border roads are also mentioned for strategic reasons and connecting remote areas.
Okay, shifting to railways. Excellent for bulky goods and large numbers of passengers over long distances. The sources note varying track gauges in different countries, broad, standard, meter gauge.
Yeah, that variation can actually be a logistical headache for international rail.
Commuter trains are highlighted as hugely popular for daily travel in and out of cities in places like the UK, USA, Japan, and India.
Definitely part of the daily grind for millions. Globally, the sources note a vast railway network. Europe has a very dense network, particularly in industrial regions, with Belgium having the highest density. Passenger transport is very significant there.
Including underground railways in major cities like London and Paris, and the Channel Tunnel linking them.
Russia relies heavily on its railways, something like 90% of its transport, with a dense network west of the Urals and Moscow as the major hub.
North America has an immense network, 40% of the world total apparently, but it's used more for long-distance freight than passengers, especially dense in the eastern industrial areas.
Canada's network, largely public, carries huge volumes of wheat and coal. Australia has that key transcontinental line connecting Perth and Sydney.
South America's network is described as dense in specific economic regions like the Pampas or Brazil's coffee-growing areas, but with limited connections between these regions. Though there's that unique transcontinental line crossing the Andes between Buenos Aires and Valparaiso.
Asia has dense networks in Japan, China, and India, but fewer elsewhere. West Asia is noted as least developed due to geography and economics, and Africa's network is sparser, often linked specifically to mining areas.
The sources specifically highlight famous transcontinental railways built for economic and political reasons, crossing vast distances.
Yeah, like the Trans-Siberian in Russia, the longest electrified line, connecting St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, really opening up Asian Russia and providing links south.
The Trans-Canadian, described as an economic artery linking different regions, industrial, agricultural, forestry, and connecting to the Great Lakes.
The Union and Pacific in the USA, running from New York to San Francisco, crucial for moving goods to coastal ports. The Australian Transcontinental from Perth to Sydney, and the historic Orient Express from Paris to Istanbul. The sources also mention a proposed Trans-Asiatic line.
Wow, epic journeys. Now, water transport. Its biggest advantage, the sources point out, is that you don't need to build the route itself for sea travel.
Right. The oceans are already connected highways, and it's significantly cheaper than land transport, generally due to less friction, lower energy costs. Just need the infrastructure at the ends, the ports.
Sea routes are the smooth highways of global trade, ideal for hauling bulky cargo over long distances. Modern technology, from radar and GPS to refrigerated chambers and containers, has massively increased their efficiency.
Definitely. The sources detail the most important sea routes. The Northern Atlantic, described as the Big Trunk Route, linking the major industrial regions of northeastern USA and northwestern Europe.
Carrying a quarter of global trade, making it the busiest route in the world.
Then the Mediterranean-Indian Ocean route, crucial for accessing the Old World, serving numerous countries. The Suez Canal is a vital bottleneck here, drastically cutting distance and time compared to going all the way around Africa.
The Cape of Good Hope route, linking Western Europe with Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, which is seeing increasing trade.
The Southern Atlantic, linking Europe-Africa with South America, though less busy due to sparser population and development in South America and Africa.
The North Pacific, linking the west coast of North America with Asia, often using the shortest Great Circle routes, with Honolulu as a key stopover point.
And the South Pacific, connecting Europe, North America to Australian NZ and the Pacific Islands, often via the Panama Canal.
Coastal shipping is mentioned, too, as a convenient, cheaper option along long coastlines in places like the USA, China, India, and Europe. It can help relieve congestion on land routes if it's developed effectively.
Definitely underutilized in some areas.
And we have vital man-made shipping canals acting as shortcuts. The Suez Canal in Egypt opened way back in 1869, linking the Mediterranean and Red Sea.
Europe's primary gateway to the Indian Ocean. It's a sea-level canal, but involves pretty hefty tolls.
And the Panama Canal, across the narrow Isthmus of Panama, linking the Atlantic and Pacific. This one uses a complex lock system to lift and lower ships across the land divide.
It dramatically reduces travel distance between coasts, cuts thousands of miles off a New York to San Francisco journey, for example, hugely vital for Latin American economies especially.
Okay, what about inland waterways, rivers, canals, lakes?
Well, they've been used for transport since ancient times and were often the main highways historically, including in India. They're great for heavy, bulky cargo like coal, timber, or ore, and sometimes the only way to move goods in dense forests.
Have they declined in importance?
In some places, yeah, due to competition from railways or water being diverted for irrigation. But developed countries have often invested heavily in making them more navigable through dredging, building dams, and locks.
Which are the key inland waterways mentioned?
The Rhine in Europe is a big one of the most heavily used waterways globally, connecting industrial Germany and the Netherlands to the North Atlantic.
The Danube in Eastern Europe, serving many countries. The Volga in Russia, an extensive navigable system linking to Moscow and the Black Sea.
The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway in North America, a really unique system allowing large ocean-going vessels deep into the continent, and the Mississippi waterways in the USA, connecting the vast interior to the Gulf of Mexico.
All right, let's move to air transport. The sources identify it as the fastest mode, obviously, but also the most costly.
Right, so it's typically preferred for long-distance passenger travel and high-value, perishable, or really urgent cargo. Things where speed outweighs cost.
It's often the only way to access remote or difficult areas, isn't it? Overcoming physical barriers like mountains or large deserts. The sources also highlight its significant strategic and military importance.
Absolutely. Air transport requires extensive and pretty expensive ground infrastructure hangars, maintenance facilities, large airports. This infrastructure is naturally most developed in industrialized countries with high traffic volumes.
The global network is growing rapidly. There's a clear concentration of routes in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly dense in Eastern USA, Western Europe, and Southeast Asia.
The sources note the USA alone accounts for a huge portion of global airways, something like 60%. Major cities act as key nodal points where routes converge and radiate out.
Areas like Africa, Asiatic Russia, and South America have much sparser networks, though.
Yeah, and the Southern Hemisphere generally has limited air services compared to the North, due to factors like lower population density, less extensive land mass at those latitudes, and different levels of economic development. The sources mention supersonic aircraft as a way to reduce travel time on long routes, though that's still niche.
Finally, pipelines. Maybe the unsung hero of transport.
Could be. used extensively for transporting liquids and gases, water, petroleum, natural gas. The sources even mentioned liquefied coal and milk pipelines in New Zealand as examples of their versatility.
The big advantage is continuous, uninterrupted flow, right?
Exactly. The sources note dense oil pipeline networks in the USA, including the famous Big Inch pipeline carrying petroleum from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast, which handles a significant portion of U.S. freight by ton kilometer.
Pipelines are also crucial in Europe, Russia, West Asia, and India for connecting production sites to refineries, ports, and markets. The sources mention pipelines from Turkmenistan and a proposed Iran-India pipeline, which would be incredibly long.
It's clear from the sources that in a well-functioning system, these different modes of transport don't just compete, they really complement each other. Each is best suited for different types of movement and distances.
These physical connections are foundational, absolutely,
Right.
but equally transformative, maybe even more so now, is the revolution in how we communicate.
Oh, definitely. Communication. The sources trace its history from earlier methods, like the telegraph, which was actually instrumental in, like the colonization of the American West,
Wow, didn't know that.
and the telephone, which was critical for urbanization in the U.S. and remains widely used today. Cell phones, often linked via satellites, are mentioned as vital for rural connectivity in developing countries now.
But the real revolution has been in telecommunications, hasn't it? Reducing the time needed for communication from weeks or days to mere minutes or even seconds.
Yeah, mobile telephony, especially using satellites, has made communication direct and instantaneous almost anywhere. Though, older systems like postal services are still used for their low cost for bulk transmission. Can't beat the price sometimes.
Technology continues to evolve so rapidly. The sources mention optic fiber cables replacing traditional copper wires,
Allowing for incredibly rapid, secure, and virtually error-free data transmission. Huge bandwidth. And the digitization of information in the 1990s led to the convergence of telecommunications and computers, forming the integrated networks we know as the Internet.
Satellites, too, pioneered back in the 1970s, are critical for connecting even the most remote parts of the globe.
Yeah, the sources explain that satellite communication makes the cost and time of sending information essentially independent of distance. Doesn't matter if you're sending it next door or across the world via satellite, cost-wise. India's satellite program, with examples like INSAT, is noted for its impact on long-distance communication, broadcasting, and weather forecasting.
And then there's cyberspace and the internet itself. How did the sources define cyberspace?
As the world of electronic computerized space, primarily represented by the World Wide Web, it's an electronic world where you can communicate and access vast amounts of information without any physical movement needed.
Its growth has been just unprecedented, hasn't it? The sources note it jumped from 50 million users globally in 1995 to over 2 billion by 2010, and still growing.
And interestingly, the majority of Internet users are now in developing countries. That's a significant shift from the early days when the USA dominated user numbers. The U.S. share dropped dramatically while places like China and India surged.
The impact of the internet is just immense. The sources highlight how cyberspace has expanded human economic and social space through things like email, e-commerce, e-learning, e-governance.
Allowing activities that previously required physical presence to happen remotely changed everything.
The sources conclude this section by stating that these modern communication systems, the internet, fax, TV, radio, perhaps even more than transportation, have truly made the concept of a global village a reality.
Seems fair. The world feels much smaller, doesn't it?
It really does.
Fair.
This incredible connectivity, both physical via transport and digital via communication, is what underpins our next big topic, international trade.
Right. International trade is defined simply as the voluntary exchange of goods and services among countries across national boundaries.
And why do countries trade?
Fundamentally, to get commodities they either can't produce themselves or can buy more cheaply elsewhere. Simple motivation.
The sources trace the history briefly, starting with the barter system. They even mention the John Bill Mela in India as a surviving example of a barter-based fare. Still happens.
Amazing. Then came money, with the word salary linked to payment by salt in Roman times, because salt was so valuable back then.
Early trade was risky, often limited to local markets or maybe high-value luxury goods transported over long distances, like silk and precious metals on the famous Silk Route connecting Rome and China.
Huge risks involved there. The growth of European commerce and the discovery of the Americas led to colonialism and, horrifically, the slave trade, which the sources note was a lucrative but abhorrent business for centuries before its eventual abolition. The sources even include the context of slave auction ads to show how normalized it was.
awful period. The Industrial Revolution dramatically changed trade again, didn't it?
Completely. Industrial nations needed raw materials, the value of which declined relative to manufactured goods, so they imported primary products and exported finished goods. Later, as more countries industrialized, they became each other's main trading partners.
Trade restrictions were common, especially during the World Wars, which led to post-war efforts like GATT and later the WTO to try and reduce tariffs and encourage trade.
Right. The basis for international trade, as the sources explain, is specialization and division of labor. Countries specialize in producing what they do best or most cheaply. This, in theory, benefits the global economy overall, based on concepts like comparative advantage.
It's not just an economic activity either. It's deeply linked to a country's foreign policy.
Absolutely. And with modern transport and communication making the world smaller, the potential benefits of participating in international trade, getting access to a wider variety of goods, achieving efficiency through specialization become much clearer.
The sources list specific factors that form the basis for trade between countries. Differences in national resources is a big one. Geology, climate leading to different minerals, crops.
Population factors too. Size, distribution, cultural preferences for specific goods like art or carpets. The stage of economic development matters. Industrial countries trade different things than agricultural ones.
Also, the extent of foreign investment, which can boost trade in developing countries lacking capital by developing industries and creating markets. And of course, transport itself, historical limitations meant limited trade, but modern transport enables truly global reach.
Okay, let's maybe look at some of the mechanics and debates surrounding international trade. Starting with the balance of trade, what is that?
It's basically the record of the value of a country's imports versus its exports.
The sources explain a negative or unfavorable balance means imports cost more than exports earn. That can be a serious issue, depleting a country's financial reserves over time.
A positive or favorable balance is the opposite. Exports are worth more than imports. That's generally seen as better.
Trade can be bilateral, an agreement between just two countries to trade specific items, or multilateral, involving trade with many countries, sometimes involving most favored nation status.
Where countries agree to give each other the same favorable trade terms they offer to any other nation.
The concept of free trade, opening economies by removing barriers like tariffs, is presented as allowing global competition, letting goods flow freely.
However, the sources also raise significant concerns and criticisms about free trade and globalization. They argue it can adversely affect developing countries.
By not providing a truly equal playing field and sometimes imposing unfavorable conditions. There's a critique that while pushing for free trade from others, developed countries may still protect their own key markets.
The sources also define and mention the practice of dumping.
Yeah, dumping is selling a commodity in a foreign country at a price below its cost, or below the price it's sold for back home, often done specifically to harm domestic producers in the target country. It's seen as unfair competition.
What about the World Trade Organization, the WTO? It was set up to manage all this.
Right, established in 1995 from the earlier GATT agreement. Its purpose is to liberalize world trade, reduce tariffs, set global rules, including for services and intellectual rights now, and resolve trade disputes between member countries.
But the sources also present some strong criticisms of the WTO, don't they?
They do. They report arguments that it hasn't necessarily made ordinary lives more prosperous and can widen the gap between rich and poor nations because powerful countries tend to prioritize their own commercial interests in negotiations.
A key critique mentioned is that many developed countries haven't fully opened their markets to developing countries' products as promised.
And the sources state that the WTO is criticized for sometimes ignoring crucial issues like health standards, workers' rights, child labor, and environmental protection in its primary focus on trade liberalization. Its headquarters are in Geneva, and India is noted as a founder member.
As a response to some of the challenges or perceived failures of global trade organizations, the sources discuss the rise of regional trade blocs.
Yes, these are formed by countries, often geographically close or economically similar, to encourage trade among themselves by removing internal tariffs. Think like the EU or NAFTA, SMCA.
The sources note their rapid growth. Over 120 blocs now exist, handling a significant portion of world trade. They remove barriers within the bloc.
But the sources warn they could potentially make trade between different blocs more difficult in the future, sort of fragmenting the global market into competing zones.
So the sources acknowledge the benefits of international trade specialization, efficiency, availability of goods, diffusion of knowledge.
Absolutely. But they also detail potential downsides quite clearly. Trade can lead to economic dependence, uneven development where some benefit much more than others, and exploitation. Commercial rivalry fueled by trade competition has even historically contributed to wars.
And significant environmental and health impacts are also raised. The push to increase production for trade can accelerate resource depletion. The sources mention concerns about marine life, forests being cut down, river basins being damaged or sold off.
Yeah, and multinational corporations focused purely on profit from trade may not always adhere to sustainable development practices, which the sources suggest has serious implications for the future environment and local communities.
Bringing it all back to the physical movement enabled by transport, all this international trade needs gateways, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And the sources describe ports and harbors as the chief gateways for international trade. They are the crucial points where goods and people enter and leave a country.
Ports provide essential facilities, places for ships to dock safely, equipment for loading and unloading all kinds of cargo, and storage areas. Port authorities manage the complex logistics, maintain access channels, provide tugboats, and supply labor.
A port's importance is usually measured by the volume of cargo and number of ships it handles. And the amount of cargo passing through a port is also seen as a key indicator of the economic development of its hinterland, the inland area it serves and draws goods from. The sources mention San Francisco as a major landlocked harbor.
The sources classify ports in various ways. By the type of cargo they handle, industrial ports specialize in bulk cargo like grain, oil, or ore.
Commercial ports handle general cargo manufactured goods, packaged items, and also passenger traffic. Comprehensive ports handle both bulk and general cargo in large volumes. These tend to be most of the world's really great ports.
They are also classified by location. Inland ports are located away from the seacoast, connected by a navigable river or canal, allowing smaller ships or barges access. Examples from the sources include Manchester in the UK via canal, Memphis via the Mississippi, Rhine ports like Mannheim and Duisburg, and Kolkata via the Hooghly River in India.
Then you have outports. These are deep-water ports built away from a main, perhaps older or shallower, ports specifically to accommodate very large modern ships that can't get into the main harbor. The sources use Athens and its outport Piraeus as an example.
And finally, classification by specialized functions. Oil ports handle the processing and shipping of oil, either tanker ports or refinery ports. Examples: Maracaibo, Abadan. Ports of call were originally just refueling or supply points on major sea routes.
But many developed into major commercial centers over time. Examples: Aden, Honolulu, Singapore.
Packet stations are essentially ferry ports for short-distance passenger and mail transport across water, typically occurring in pairs facing each other, like Dover and Calais across the English Channel.
Entrepot ports are major collection centers for goods coming from different places that are then consolidated and re-exported. Big transshipment hubs. Examples given are Singapore, Rotterdam, Copenhagen.
And naval ports are primarily strategic ports serving warships, often with repair facilities. Examples: Kochi and Karwar in India are mentioned.
So these ports are the tangible points where the services of transport and trade physically converge, linking global production to global consumption. The critical nodes.
Okay, so pulling back, we've really seen how modern economies are fundamentally service and knowledge-driven, moving way beyond just making things. We've explored the incredible physical networks of transport roads, rail, water, air, pipelines, and the digital revolution in communication that connect the world at, well, unprecedented speed.
And we've looked at international trade, the global system of exchange that relies on all of this connectivity. We examined both its basis and its significant benefits in terms of efficiency and availability, but also the complex critiques around equity, who truly benefits, and the environmental costs highlighted in the sources.
These sectors aren't isolated at all. They are deeply interconnected, aren't they? The vast reach of services and knowledge work we discussed earlier is only possible because of the efficiency provided by global transport and communication systems,
which in turn facilitate international trade. It's all linked.
The picture painted by the sources is one of incredible complexity and interdependence. Developed economies thrive on services, global connectivity is faster and more pervasive than ever, and trade drives much of the world's economy. But it's clearly not a system without challenges or critics.
No, it presents a world knitted together, but perhaps, unevenly, some threads stronger than others.
And that leads to a powerful final thought kind of raised by the material. As these global systems of services, transport, communication, and trade continue to evolve, often driven by efficiency and profit, well, what responsibility do we have, or what changes might be needed to ensure they contribute more effectively to equitable development and sustainability across the planet?
That's a big question.
It is. It's a question that definitely lingers well beyond this deep dive, something for all of us to think about.